May 8, 1945 dawned over Berlin with an eerie silence that seemed impossible after years of thundering warfare. The guns had finally stopped. The Third Reich had collapsed. German civilians emerged from basements and bomb shelters, stepping carefully through rubble-strewn streets where entire neighborhoods had been reduced to skeletal remains of buildings. They moved like ghosts through their own city, searching for food, water, and any sign of surviving family members. But amid the devastation and shock of total defeat, something peculiar caught their attention on walls throughout the ruined capital. Scrawled in chalk, charcoal, and paint across broken concrete surfaces appeared a strange phrase accompanied by an even stranger drawing. "Kilroy was here," it declared in English, alongside a simple cartoon of a bald head with a prominent nose peering over a fence, two hands gripping the top. The image was crude yet instantly recognizable, and it was everywhere. On the Reichstag's damaged walls, across demolished Wehrmacht bunkers, on abandoned Panzer tanks, even on the walls of Hitler's bunker complex itself. For the German civilians, exhausted and traumatized by total war, this mysterious graffiti represented something deeply unsettling. Who was this Kilroy? How had he managed to mark seemingly every surface in their conquered nation? The omnipresence of the graffiti suggested a supernatural ability to be everywhere at once, witnessing everything. Some whispered that Kilroy must be an American spy of exceptional capability, perhaps even the code name for an entire network of intelligence operatives who had infiltrated Germany long before the final collapse. Elderly Berliners stood before these markings with furrowed brows, trying to comprehend this strange American phenomenon. Children, despite the horror surrounding them, found themselves oddly fascinated by the simple cartoon face. Women carrying buckets of water from broken pipes paused to stare at the graffiti, wondering what it meant for their future under occupation. The phrase appeared so frequently that it became impossible to ignore, a constant reminder that American soldiers had passed through, claiming territory with this peculiar signature. According to historical accounts documented in various military journals and memoirs from the period, including references in the United States Army's official histories, the Kilroy phenomenon had actually begun years earlier in American shipyards and military installations. However, to the German population encountering it for the first time in their defeated homeland, it represented something entirely new and inexplicable. The graffiti seemed to mock their defeat while simultaneously puzzling them with its childlike simplicity. In the working-class districts of Berlin, in the wealthy neighborhoods of Munich, across the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, the same scene repeated itself. German citizens discovered these markings and tried to make sense of them. Some attempted to scrub the graffiti away, viewing it as a desecration of their homeland. Others left it untouched, perhaps fearing retribution from the occupying forces, or perhaps simply too exhausted by catastrophe to care about marks on walls. The spring of 1945 brought not just military occupation, but cultural occupation as well. The Kilroy graffiti represented the first wave of American cultural influence that would reshape Germany in the coming years. But in those initial days and weeks after surrender, before anyone explained the joke, before the mystery was solved, German civilians could only stare at these strange markings and wonder what kind of people had defeated them. People who declared their presence not with threats or proclamations, but with a cartoon character, and a simple phrase that seemed to be everywhere at once. The story of Kilroy began long before German civilians encountered the mysterious graffiti in their conquered homeland. Sometime around 1941, in the shipyards of Quincy, Massachusetts, an inspector named James Kilroy worked for the Bethlehem Steel Company, checking welds and rivets on warships destined for the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. Kilroy had a simple habit that would inadvertently create one of the most widespread cultural phenomena of the Second World War. Each time he inspected a section of a ship, he marked it with chalk to show that his work was complete. Kilroy was here. This practice served a practical purpose in the shipyard's payment system. Welders were paid by the number of completed sections, and Kilroy's mark prevented them from claiming credit for the same work twice. However, shipyard workers typically erased these inspection marks before the vessels left the yard. In the frantic pace of wartime production, with ships being rushed from construction to combat, many of Kilroy's marks remained hidden inside the vessels, in sealed compartments, behind bulkheads, and in spaces that would normally never be seen again. American servicemen boarding these brand new ships discovered the mysterious phrase in the strangest places. They found "Kilroy was here," in the bowels of battleships, inside the hulls of destroyers, even in spaces that appeared to be completely sealed. To these young sailors and soldiers, many of whom had never left their home states before the war, the omnipresent phrase became a source of endless fascination and humor. Who was this Kilroy character who somehow managed to get everywhere first? The phrase might have remained a naval curiosity had it not merged with another wartime phenomenon. Around the same time, a British cartoon character called Mr. Chad, or What No, had become popular, depicting a bald head peering over a wall. When American troops encountered British forces in North Africa and Europe, the two traditions merged. American servicemen began adding the bald, long-nosed character to the "Kilroy Was Here" phrase, creating the iconic image that would sweep across every theater of the war. What made Kilroy truly powerful was what he represented to American soldiers. In the chaos and terror of combat, in the loneliness of foreign lands, in the boredom of military bureaucracy, Kilroy became a secret handshake among troops. Leaving a Kilroy mark meant you had been there first. Finding one meant another American had passed that way before you. The graffiti became a form of communication, proof that you existed, evidence that despite the vast machinery of modern warfare trying to reduce individuals to numbers and units, personal identity still mattered. As referenced in numerous military unit histories and veterans' memoirs compiled by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, American soldiers took Kilroy with them everywhere they fought. The graffiti appeared in North African desert fortifications, on Italian church walls in French chateaux and throughout the Pacific Islands. Paratroopers drew Kilroy on the sides of aircraft before jumping into France on D-Day. Tank crews painted him on their armored vehicles. Engineers carved him into bridges they constructed. Infantrymen scratched him onto captured German equipment and fortifications. The competition to place Kilroy in the most outrageous or impossible location became an unofficial contest among American troops. Climbers left Kilroy marks on mountain peaks. Divers supposedly left waterproof versions on sunken vessels. The phrase appeared at the tops of the Eiffel Tower, inside the Arc de Triomphe, and allegedly even inside the torch of the Statue of Liberty, when servicemen had access during the war. Each new Kilroy represented both a territorial claim and a joke, a small act of individual expression in the vast collective effort of global war. By 1945, as American forces pushed into Germany itself, Kilroy had evolved from a shipyard inspector's mark into a symbol of American presence, humor, and irrepressibility. The simple graffiti carried complex meanings: defiance, humor, individual identity, and the strange democracy of American culture where even private soldiers felt entitled to leave their mark on history. Frau Margareta Schmidt stood before the damaged wall of what had once been her neighborhood bakery in Hamburg, staring at the curious drawing that had appeared overnight. The date was May 15th, 1945, exactly 1 week after the Wehrmacht's unconditional surrender. Margaret was 47 years old, a widow since Stalingrad had claimed her husband 3 years earlier, and she had survived the firebombing that had turned Hamburg into an inferno in 1943. She had witnessed horrors that would haunt her remaining days, but this simple cartoon puzzled her in a way that violence never had. "What does it mean, Mutti?" her daughter Anna asked, clutching a ration card they hoped to exchange for bread at whatever distribution point the British occupiers had established. Anna was 14, old enough to remember life before the war, but young enough to find fascination in the strange marking rather than only seeing another sign of national defeat. Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't know, Liebling. Some American foolishness, I suppose." But privately she wondered if there was more to it. The image appeared too frequently to be random vandalism. It must mean something to the conquerors, must serve some purpose beyond mere mockery of the defeated. Throughout Germany, similar conversations unfolded in countless variations. In Munich, Herr Wilhelm Bachmann, a former schoolteacher who had lost his position for insufficient enthusiasm for National Socialist ideology, studied the Kilroy markings with intellectual curiosity. To him, the graffiti represented something fundamentally foreign about American culture. Germans had been taught that war was serious, that military occupation was about power and dominance. Yet here were the victors announcing their presence with cartoons. What kind of soldiers found time for such frivolity amid the ruins of total war? The initial German reaction to Kilroy ranged from confusion to fear to grudging fascination. Some elderly Germans, remembering the French occupation of the Rhineland after the First World War, expected harsh military rule and saw the graffiti as a sinister warning that American eyes were everywhere. Younger Germans, exhausted by years of Nazi propaganda about Germanic superiority and the degeneracy of American culture, found their expectations challenged by this strange phenomenon. If Americans were the uncultured barbarians described in propaganda, why did their graffiti suggest a sense of humor rather than brutality? In the Soviet-occupied zones of Eastern Germany, similar markings occasionally appeared, though the Red Army had its own traditions, and the Kilroy phenomenon remained primarily associated with American and British forces. German civilians quickly learned to distinguish between occupation zones partly by such cultural markers. The Americans brought Kilroy, chewing gum, jazz music, and a casual approach to military authority that Germans found both bewildering and, secretly, somewhat refreshing compared to their own rigid military traditions. Former Wehrmacht soldiers, now prisoners or simply attempting to blend back into civilian life, had their own reactions to the ubiquitous graffiti. Many had encountered Kilroy during the war itself, scratched onto captured American equipment or drawn on the walls of positions that had changed hands during battle. Some soldiers had wondered if Kilroy was a psychological warfare tactic meant to unnerve German troops by suggesting American infiltration. Others had assumed it was simply the name of a particularly bold American scout who somehow managed to penetrate German lines with remarkable frequency. Franz Keller, a former Unteroffizier who had fought in France and later in the Battle of the Bulge, recognized Kilroy immediately when he returned to his family's farm in Bavaria. He had seen the marking in a captured American pillbox in Belgium, drawn in what appeared to be lipstick on the concrete wall. At the time, he had felt a strange respect for the enemy soldier who had taken time to leave such a mark even under combat conditions. Now, seeing Kilroy on a barn wall near his home, Franz felt the full weight of Germany's defeat. The Americans had not just won militarily, they had claimed the very landscape with their cultural symbols. The psychological impact of Kilroy on the defeated German population should not be underestimated. After years of being told that victory was inevitable, that Germanic culture was superior, that enemies were subhuman, the German people confronted a contradiction. The Americans who had defeated them were clearly not what propaganda had described. They were powerful enough to destroy the Wehrmacht, yet playful enough to cover walls with cartoons. They were organized enough to coordinate massive military operations, yet individualistic enough that common soldiers felt free to leave personal marks everywhere they went. By June of 1945, as the Allied occupation became more established and German society began the painful process of emerging from National Socialist rule, the Kilroy phenomenon had spawned a rich folklore among the defeated population. In the cafes of Berlin that were beginning to reopen, in the breadlines of Frankfurt, in the refugee camps where millions of displaced Germans sought shelter, stories about Kilroy circulated with increasing embellishment and concern. One particularly persistent rumor claimed that Kilroy was actually the code name for a secret American intelligence agency that had infiltrated Germany years before the war's end. According to this theory, thousands of operatives had worked throughout the Reich, gathering information and marking locations of strategic importance. The graffiti, believers in this story insisted, was a way for these spies to communicate with each other, with the simple phrase and drawing actually representing coded messages about troop positions, industrial targets, or Nazi officials' locations. In Stuttgart, a group of former civil servants convinced themselves that the different styles of Kilroy drawings contained hidden meanings. A Kilroy with his fingers drawn further apart meant one thing, while fingers closer together indicated another message. The angle of the nose supposedly signified different types of intelligence reports. These amateur codebreakers spent hours examining various Kilroy markings around their city, trying to decipher patterns that existed only in their desperate attempt to find order in chaos and defeat. Another widespread belief held that Kilroy was a supernatural being, perhaps a ghost or spirit that followed the American armies. How else could one explain the markings' appearance in locations that seemed impossible for any human to reach? German civilians reported finding Kilroy graffiti atop tall radio towers, on bridges that had been destroyed before American forces arrived, and inside buildings that had supposedly been locked and guarded. Each impossible appearance added to the mystique and fear surrounding the mysterious figure. Some Germans developed more cynical interpretations. They theorized that Kilroy was a deliberate psychological warfare campaign, designed to make the German population feel constantly watched and monitored by occupation forces. This interpretation had a grain of truth to it, though not in the way these Germans imagined. While Kilroy had not been created as psychological warfare, American soldiers certainly enjoyed the anxiety and curiosity it provoked among defeated enemies. The paranoia surrounding Kilroy occasionally had real consequences. In one documented incident in Cologne, local German authorities arrested an elderly man who they suspected of being an American collaborator based on his knowledge of what Kilroy meant. The man had simply overheard American soldiers joking about the graffiti and understood enough English to grasp the explanation. His arrest highlighted both the continued dysfunction of German society in the immediate post-war period and the power of Kilroy to generate genuine concern among the occupied population. Children developed their own myths about Kilroy. Some German children convinced themselves that Kilroy was a monster who came at night to mark houses where bad people lived, essentially transforming the graffiti into a supernatural moral authority figure. This childish interpretation revealed something profound about the psychological impact of occupation. The conquering Americans had replaced the Nazi regime not just politically, but symbolically, with Kilroy serving as a kind of omniscient judge whose presence indicated that someone had been witnessed, recorded, and potentially judged. Religious interpretations also emerged in some communities. A Protestant minister in Hamburg reportedly preached a sermon comparing Kilroy to the biblical concept of divine omnipresence, suggesting that just as God sees all, the Americans seem to have been everywhere during their conquest of Germany. Whether the minister intended this as a criticism of American presumption or as a theological meditation on accountability for Germany's wartime actions remained ambiguous. As documented in various post-war intelligence reports compiled by American military government officials, including references in documents later archived by the National Archives, the American occupation authorities became aware of the various myths surrounding Kilroy and generally found them amusing. Some officers saw value in allowing Germans to believe that Kilroy represented more sophisticated surveillance than actually existed. Others worried that the paranoia might interfere with reconstruction efforts and attempted to explain the phenomenon to German civilian leaders. Werner Hoffmann, a former journalist who had lost his position during the Nazi coordination of the press, approached an American military government office in Bremen to ask directly about Kilroy. The American lieutenant he spoke with, a young man from Ohio who had studied German literature before the war, found himself in the peculiar position of explaining American popular culture to an educated German. The lieutenant tried to convey that Kilroy was essentially a joke, a piece of folklore, but Hoffmann struggled to understand how something so widespread could lack official sanction or deeper meaning. This cultural disconnect revealed fundamental differences in how Americans and Germans approached authority and social organization. German society, particularly after 12 years of totalitarian rule, had been conditioned to see deliberate purpose and hierarchical approval behind most public expressions. The idea that individual American soldiers, acting without orders or coordination, had created a nationwide phenomenon simply because they found it entertaining, challenged basic German assumptions about how societies functioned. August of 1945 brought the first systematic attempts by American occupation authorities to explain the Kilroy phenomenon to puzzled German civilians. Major Robert Harrison, assigned to the military government office in Frankfurt, had grown tired of the constant questions and rumors surrounding the graffiti. During a town meeting with local German leaders meant to discuss food distribution and reconstruction priorities, the topic of Kilroy inevitably arose, and Harrison decided to settle the matter once and for all. "Gentlemen and ladies," Harrison began in his textbook German, which carried a strong Midwestern American accent, "Kilroy is not a spy, not a military unit, and certainly not a ghost. He's a joke, That's all. American soldiers draw him on walls as a way of saying they were there before the next group of soldiers arrived. The assembled Germans exchanged glances that mixed skepticism with incomprehension. Herr Dr. Ernst Mannheim, a former city administrator who was cautiously attempting to work with the occupation authorities, raised his hand. Major Harrison, with respect, how can this be merely a joke? The marking appears thousands of times in every city, on every type of structure. Surely such coordination requires orders, organization, command structure. Harrison smiled, recognizing the cultural gap he needed to bridge. That's exactly what makes it remarkable, Herr Doctor. Nobody ordered American soldiers to draw Kilroy. Nobody coordinated it. One soldier saw another soldier do it, thought it was funny, and did it himself. Then another soldier saw that and did the same. It spread organically, you might say, like a virus of humor. This explanation seemed to disturb the Germans more than reassure them. A society that had just experienced the ultimate conclusion of hierarchical command and centralized control found it difficult to comprehend how something so widespread could emerge from individual initiative without any official sanction. What kind of military allowed such disorder? And if the American military permitted such undisciplined behavior, how had they managed to defeat the Wehrmacht? Over the following months, as American newspapers and magazines began circulating in occupied Germany, the truth about Kilroy gradually spread through the German population. The Saturday Evening Post ran a feature article in September of 1945 that traced Kilroy's origins back to James Kilroy's shipyard inspections. This article, as referenced in various historical accounts of post-war American culture, finally provided authoritative documentation of the phenomenon's innocent origins. Copies of the magazine made their way to Germany, where they were passed around among Germans curious about American culture. For many Germans, learning the truth about Kilroy provided their first real glimpse into American society's fundamental character. The story revealed a culture that valued individual expression, even within military structures, that found humor in chaos, and that created meaning through informal social networks rather than top-down commands. These were alien concepts to a population that had been organized into strictly controlled hierarchies for over a decade. Greta Schneider, a schoolteacher in Dresden who had survived the devastating February bombing of that city, read about Kilroy's origins in a translated American magazine article. She sat in the ruins of what had been her school, using broken desks as furniture, and contemplated what the story revealed. "They defeated us with cartoon characters," she wrote in her diary, which would later be published as part of a collection of post-war German testimonies. Not because they turned war into a joke, but because they remained human enough to make jokes even during war. We became machines. They stayed men. Not all Germans found the Kilroy explanation satisfactory or admirable. Some former Nazi officials, now attempting to blend into civilian life or awaiting trials for war crimes, seized on Kilroy as evidence of American lack of seriousness and discipline. In beer halls and private conversations, these unreconstructed National Socialists muttered that the Americans had won through material superiority and Soviet alliance, not through any cultural advantage. The fact that victorious American soldiers defaced walls with graffiti proved in their twisted logic that German culture remained superior even in defeat. Younger Germans, particularly teenagers and those in their early 20s, often had different reactions. They had been raised under Nazism but were young enough to remain flexible in their thinking, and many found themselves attracted to what Kilroy represented. The graffiti suggested freedom, individualism, and a lighter approach to authority than they had ever known. As American jazz music, movies, and other cultural products began flowing into Germany, Kilroy served as an introduction to a broader cultural system that many young Germans found appealing, compared to the rigid authoritarianism that had dominated their formative years. The intellectual community in occupied Germany engaged with Kilroy on a more philosophical level. Writers, artists, and academics who had survived the Nazi years began analyzing what the phenomenon revealed about American versus German cultural values. Essays appeared in newly licensed German newspapers exploring themes of individualism, humor as resistance, and the democratization of expression. Some intellectuals saw Kilroy as evidence that American democracy extended even into military structures. creating soldiers who thought of themselves as individuals, rather than just cogs in a machine. By the end of 1945, most Germans had learned the truth about Kilroy, though the legend's more colorful embellishments persisted in some communities. The graffiti continued to appear on walls throughout occupied Germany as new American troops rotated in, each generation of soldiers maintaining the tradition. But as Germans became more familiar with their occupiers, Kilroy lost his mysterious terror and became instead a kind of mascot for the American presence, simultaneously annoying and oddly endearing to a population learning to live under foreign administration. January of 1946 marked a shift in how German civilians perceived and interacted with American occupation culture, including the omnipresent Kilroy graffiti. The immediate chaos of defeat had given way to the grinding reality of occupation life. Food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, millions of displaced persons, and the slow, painful process of denazification and reconstruction. Within this challenging environment, Kilroy evolved from a mysterious threat into something more complex and, surprisingly, sometimes even a source of dark humor among Germans themselves. In the American sector of Berlin, a remarkable transformation occurred in a neighborhood near Tempelhof Airfield. German children, initially frightened by the strange occupiers and their peculiar customs, began imitating Kilroy themselves. Young boys chalked crude versions of the bald-headed figure on bombed-out walls, adding German phrases like Heinrich war here or Klaus war here. American soldiers patrolling these neighborhoods initially found this imitation amusing, then oddly touching. These children, who had been raised to fear and hate Americans, were now adopting American cultural symbols as their own form of play and expression. Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Brooklyn noticed this phenomenon during his patrols. He began carrying extra chalk and would sometimes stop to draw Kilroy with the watching children, teaching them the proper way to create the image. Through these small interactions, conducted mostly through gesture since few spoke each other's languages, a kind of cultural exchange occurred. O'Brien wrote home to his wife describing these encounters. "The kids here have nothing. Their city is rubble. But they still find ways to play, and now they're playing at being little American soldiers, drawing our dumb cartoon everywhere. It's the strangest thing." The adoption of Kilroy by German youth troubled some older Germans who saw it as a betrayal of German culture and an acceptance of defeat. Former teachers and civil servants who had survived the Nazi era worried that the younger generation was abandoning Germanic values too quickly, embracing American culture without resistance. These concerns reflected larger anxieties about Germany's future identity in the wake of total military, political, and moral collapse. However, other Germans saw the Kilroy exchange as potentially positive. Friedrich Weber, a Protestant minister in Munich who had quietly opposed the Nazi regime and survived, viewed the graffiti as a symbol of reconciliation. In his sermons, Weber began referencing Kilroy as an example of how even small, seemingly meaningless gestures could bridge cultural divides. "This silly drawing," he preached to his congregation in February of 1946, "reminds us that our former enemies are human beings who laugh, who play, who mark their presence on the world in the same childish ways we do. Perhaps that is the beginning of understanding." The American military government's approach to Kilroy became more sophisticated as the occupation matured. Information officers recognized that the graffiti could serve educational purposes, providing an entry point for teaching Germans about American democratic culture. Officially sponsored newspapers for German audiences occasionally ran light-hearted articles about Kilroy, using the phenomenon to illustrate broader points about American values like individual initiative, humor, and freedom of expression within reasonable bounds. In the British occupation zone, where the Chad-Kilroy combination was particularly prevalent given the British origins of the Chad character, similar cultural exchanges occurred with some variations. British soldiers, dealing with their own post-war exhaustion and privation, found that their version of the cartoon could serve as a conversation starter with German civilians. The phrase "what, no," followed by words like food or houses, resonated with Germans who were experiencing severe shortages, creating unexpected moments of shared dark humor about post-war conditions. The French occupation zone in southwestern Germany saw less Kilroy graffiti, but developed its own cultural exchanges around similar themes. French soldiers brought their own cultural expressions to the occupation, and Germans in these regions found themselves navigating yet another set of occupier customs and symbols. The variation in cultural expressions across different zones helped some Germans recognize that the Allies were not a monolithic entity, but rather distinct national cultures with different traditions and approaches. As referenced in various sociological studies of post-war Germany conducted by American university researchers in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Kilroy phenomenon became a subject of academic interest. Researchers studying how occupied populations adapt to foreign military presence noted that shared symbols like Kilroy could facilitate the difficult process of former enemies learning to coexist. These studies documented how something as simple as graffiti could serve as a cultural ambassador, making the occupiers seem less foreign and threatening over time. Anna Schmidt, now 15, had evolved in her relationship with Kilroy since her mother had first shown her the mysterious graffiti. By early 1946, Anna had befriended several American soldiers who regularly passed through her neighborhood. One soldier, a young man from Texas named Private James Cooper, had taught her the Kilroy story and showed her how to draw the cartoon properly. Anna practiced in her notebook during the few hours her school operated in a partially destroyed building. Drawing Kilroy became a small act of defiance against the depression and despair that surrounded her, a tiny embrace of something new and different. Not everyone approved of Anna's enthusiasm for American culture. Her grandmother, who remembered the First World War and had lost sons in both wars, scolded her for being too friendly with the occupiers. "Have you no dignity?" the old woman demanded. "These people destroyed our country." Anna struggled to explain that she didn't see it that way anymore, that the Americans she met seemed like ordinary people rather than monsters, and that perhaps embracing their culture was not surrender but survival, a way of building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. May of 1946 brought an unexpected development in the Kilroy saga, when the American Transit Association held a contest to find the real Kilroy. Despite the phenomenon's widespread adoption and numerous individuals claiming to be the original, the association wanted to authenticate the origin story that had become American folklore. James Kilroy, the shipyard inspector from Massachusetts whose chalk marks had inadvertently started the entire phenomenon, came forward with documentation proving his role. He presented records from Bethlehem Steel, showing his inspection marking practices, and co-workers verified his story. The contest and Kilroy's victory received extensive coverage in American newspapers and radio broadcasts. This official recognition transformed the Kilroy story from military folklore into documented history. American soldiers stationed in Germany heard about the contest results and shared the news with German acquaintances who had remained curious about the graffiti's origins. The fact that Americans had held a national contest to identify the source of what Germans had initially feared as a spy network struck many Germans as quintessentially American, turning a moment of cultural curiosity into public entertainment and democratic participation. Kilroy's prize included a substantial shipment of building materials, a desperately needed commodity in post-war America, though nothing compared to the shortages in defeated Germany. The irony that the man whose name had become synonymous with abundance and presence everywhere received practical construction supplies seemed fitting to those following the story. For Germans learning about this contest through occupation newspapers and radio broadcasts, the resolution of the Kilroy mystery provided closure to one of the smaller but more persistent puzzles of the occupation period. The authentication of James Kilroy's story had an unexpected effect on German perceptions of American culture. The narrative reinforced the image of America as a place where ordinary working people could become famous, where a simple shipyard inspector's habit could accidentally create a nationwide phenomenon without any elite intervention or official sanction. This bottom-up cultural creation stood in stark contrast to the top-down cultural management Germans had experienced under National Socialism, where virtually every public expression required official approval and served state propaganda purposes. By late 1946, as Germany entered its second year of occupation and began the long process of reconstruction, the Kilroy graffiti started to fade from walls through a combination of weather, deliberate cleaning by Germans trying to restore some appearance of order to their cities, and simple familiarity. What had once seemed mysterious and threatening had become commonplace and understood. New American troops still drew Kilroy occasionally, maintaining the tradition, but the phenomenon no longer generated the intense curiosity and speculation it had provoked in 1945. The Marshall Plan's announcement in June of 1947, promising massive American economic assistance to rebuild war-devastated Europe, created a new context for understanding symbols like Kilroy. Germans began to see American culture not just as the culture of occupiers, but as something they needed to understand and potentially adopt if they wanted to participate in the Reconstruction program. Learning English became a priority for many Germans seeking employment with American military government or businesses. Understanding American cultural references, including Kilroy, became practical knowledge rather than just curiosity about conquerors. Sociologists and historians studying the occupation period noted that Kilroy served as what they termed a cultural bridge during a critical transition period. During the months when Germans were still processing their defeat but before clear plans for reconstruction had emerged, the graffiti provided a relatively safe topic for interaction between occupiers and occupied. Germans could ask American soldiers about Kilroy without seeming to collaborate politically. Americans could explain Kilroy without appearing to lecture about serious political matters. These small exchanges built human connections that eventually facilitated the larger project of transforming former enemies into Cold War allies. The contrast between Kilroy and the massive propaganda symbols of the Nazi regime became a subject of reflection for German intellectuals attempting to understand what had gone wrong with their society. The Nazi regime had covered Germany with swastikas, heroic statues, intimidating architecture, and carefully designed visual propaganda meant to glorify the state and terrify enemies. Americans had covered Germany with a cartoon, yet the Americans had won. This inversion of expectations forced some Germans to reconsider assumptions about power, culture, and effective communication. As referenced in various memoirs and oral history collections documenting the immediate post-war period in Germany, many Germans who were children or teenagers during the occupation years retained vivid memories of Kilroy decades later. For some, the graffiti represented their first positive association with Americans. For others, it symbolized the strange mixture of power and informality that characterized American culture. Some German children who had drawn their own Kilroy imitations in 1946 and 1947 grew up to study in American universities in the 1950s and 60s, eventually becoming part of the generation that rebuilt German democracy with strong transatlantic ties. Werner Fischer, who had been a 10-year-old boy in Frankfurt when the Americans arrived, later became a translator and cultural liaison. He recalled in a 1998 interview, "Kilroy was the first American word I learned besides okay and chewing gum. My friends and I drew him everywhere, competing to put him in the most unusual places. We didn't understand then that we were participating in cultural exchange, that we were beginning to think of Americans not as conquerors but as people with their own strange customs. But that's exactly what was happening, one silly drawing at a time. The evolution of Kilroy from mysterious threat to cultural ambassador to nostalgic memory mirrored Germany's larger transformation from enemy to occupied territory to ally. By the time the Federal Republic of Germany was established in May of 1949, Kilroy had largely disappeared from German walls, but he had left an imprint on the generation that lived through the occupation. That generation would build the new Germany, with an understanding that cultural exchange, even in its most trivial forms, could create connections across seemingly unbridgeable divides. November of 1947 marked a significant point in the occupation, when differences between the four zones of divided Germany had become starkly apparent. The American sector, where Kilroy remained most prevalent, had evolved differently from the Soviet zone in the east, where graffiti of any unofficial nature was discouraged if not outright prohibited. This divergence in something as simple as tolerance for soldier-created graffiti reflected deeper ideological differences that would eventually crystallize into the Cold War division of Germany. In the Soviet occupation zone, German civilians noticed the absence of playful graffiti like Kilroy with mixed feelings. The Red Army's approach to occupation reflected Soviet society's own characteristics: centralized control, official messaging, and little tolerance for individual soldier initiative that might deviate from approved propaganda. Soviet soldiers who attempted to create their own versions of humorous or personal graffiti often faced disciplinary action. German civilians in the East noticed that official Soviet propaganda posters covered walls instead of spontaneous soldier markings. Elsa Richter, a schoolteacher in Leipzig who lived in the Soviet zone but occasionally traveled to the American zone to visit relatives, observed these differences with keen interest. She noted in her diary entries from late 1947 that the presence of Kilroy and other informal American expressions in the Western zones suggested greater individual freedom for soldiers, which implied greater freedom in American society generally. The Americans let their young men draw on walls, she wrote. The Soviets do not. What does this tell us about the societies they represent? Everything, I think. The French occupation zone in southwest Germany developed its own character, influenced by France's complex relationship with Germany and its own occupation by Nazi forces earlier in the war. French soldiers were less likely to draw Kilroy, having their own cultural expressions, but they generally tolerated the phenomenon when it appeared. German civilians in the French zone found themselves navigating a different cultural landscape, one shaped by centuries of French-German interaction and conflict. The presence or absence of symbols like Kilroy became one way Germans unconsciously measured the character of their particular occupiers. The British zone, covering much of northwestern Germany including major industrial regions, saw a combination of the original Chad cartoon and the American Kilroy, reflecting the mixed British and American forces that had liberated these areas. Some Germans developed the ability to distinguish between British-drawn and American-drawn versions based on subtle stylistic differences, becoming inadvertent experts in occupier graffiti styles. This oddly specific knowledge reflected the peculiar education that occupation provided, learning to read the cultural signatures of foreign militaries that controlled daily life. By 1948, as tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies escalated toward crisis, these cultural differences acquired political significance. The Berlin blockade, which began in June of 1948, divided the former German capital into hostile camps. West Berliners who had become accustomed to American presence and culture, including icons like Kilroy, found themselves suddenly cut off from the Soviet sector. The graffiti that had once merely puzzled Germans now symbolized alignment with Western democracy against Soviet communism. During the Berlin airlift, which sustained West Berlin through the blockade, American pilots and support personnel who flew supplies into Tempelhof and other airfields maintained the Kilroy tradition. German workers who helped unload cargo planes found Kilroy marked on crates and aircraft. The graffiti acquired new meaning in this context, a symbol of Allied determination and support during a crisis. Some West Berliners began drawing their own Kilroy figures as expressions of solidarity with the Western powers, a remarkable transformation from the confusion and fear the symbol had provoked just 3 years earlier. As documented in various historical analyses of the Berlin blockade, including references to contemporary newspaper accounts and later academic studies, the cultural dimension of the Cold War emerged partly through seemingly trivial differences in how the occupying powers allowed or suppressed individual expression. Kilroy represented Western tolerance for unofficial cultural production, while the absence of similar Soviet phenomena reflected different values and social organization. Germans on both sides of the emerging division noticed these differences and drew conclusions about which system they preferred. Klaus Becker, a young man who worked as a translator for American forces in Berlin during the airlift, later reflected on how symbols like Kilroy shaped his political development. "I was not political before the blockade," he recalled in a 1984 interview. "I just wanted to survive and rebuild. But when I saw the differences between how the Americans and Soviets operated, even in small things like allowing graffiti, I began to understand that these were not just different armies but different philosophies of human organization. Kilroy seemed like a joke, but it represented freedom in a way I had not appreciated before." The currency reform of June 1948, which split Germany economically between East and West, was paralleled by a cultural split that included different tolerance for informal expression. In the Western zones, Kilroy continued to appear as American troops rotated through, each new cohort maintaining traditions passed down from earlier units. In the East, such spontaneous expression became increasingly risky as the Soviet occupation hardened into a satellite communist state. Germans who crossed between zones noticed these differences and factored them into decisions about where to live and work. Children who grew up in different occupation zones developed different cultural literacies. Western zone children learned about American popular culture, including icons like Kilroy, Mickey Mouse, and Coca-Cola. Eastern zone children learned about Soviet heroes and official culture, with little exposure to Western informal expression. These childhood experiences shaped generational identities that would persist through Germany's division and beyond reunification. Kilroy was part of the Western-oriented childhood for millions of Germans who came of age under American, British, and French occupation. By the time the Federal Republic of Germany was established in May of 1949 in the Western zones, and the German Democratic Republic followed in October in the Soviet zone, the cultural differences signaled by phenomena like Kilroy had crystallized into political division. The graffiti that had once merely puzzled Germans had become part of the symbolic landscape differentiating democratic West Germany from communist East Germany. What began as a simple cartoon had inadvertently participated in one of the 20th century's great geopolitical divisions. March of 1952 found Germany deeply divided but also deeply changed from the rubble-strewn landscape of 1945. The Federal Republic in the West had begun its economic miracle, transforming from devastation to prosperity with remarkable speed. Kilroy graffiti had largely disappeared from walls by this point, replaced by reconstruction, new buildings, and deliberate efforts to create a new visual landscape for a new Germany. Yet the cultural memory of the phenomenon persisted, particularly among the generation that had experienced the occupation years. For German historians and sociologists beginning to analyze the occupation period, Kilroy became a case study in cultural transfer and soft power. University seminars in Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Munich discussed how American popular culture had penetrated Germany not through official programming, but through informal soldier behavior. Kilroy represented the unplanned, organic spread of cultural symbols, demonstrating that official cultural diplomacy was only part of how nations influenced each other. The graffiti had accomplished what no number of official pamphlets or programs could have. It humanized the American occupiers by revealing their playfulness and individual initiative. Young German intellectuals who had been children during the occupation began writing about their experiences in ways that incorporated cultural symbols, like Kilroy. Günter Grass, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Literature, was a young writer in this period, and while his work focused on weightier themes of German guilt and identity, the landscape he described included these small cultural markers of the occupation. The presence of American cultural symbols in everyday German life became part of the texture of post-war literature, a constant reminder that Germany's transformation involved external influences. The contrast between how Germany and Japan experienced American occupation included interesting differences in cultural phenomena like Kilroy. While American soldiers had also spread Kilroy graffiti throughout occupied Japan, the cultural context was different enough that Japanese responses diverged from German ones. Comparing these two major occupations, scholars noted that Germans and Japanese adapted American cultural imports in ways that reflected their own cultural values and defeat experiences. Kilroy became part of comparative occupation studies, a small but illustrative example of cultural exchange under conditions of military defeat. In East Germany, behind what Winston Churchill had famously termed the Iron Curtain in his 1946 speech, memories of Kilroy took on different significance. Germans who had briefly experienced American occupation in areas later handed over to Soviet control remembered the graffiti as part of a lost alternative future. The playfulness and freedom that Kilroy represented became associated with the West in general, a symbol of what might have been if the Soviets had not occupied Eastern Germany. In this context, memory of the graffiti acquired political meaning as a marker of Western values. By the late 1950s, as West Germany became firmly integrated into NATO and the Western Alliance, American military personnel remained stationed throughout the country, though in different circumstances than the occupation years. New generations of American soldiers learned about Kilroy through military tradition, but few continued drawing the graffiti with the same enthusiasm as World War II veterans. The phenomenon had become historical, something old guys had done during the real war. Yet Kilroy persisted in American military culture as part of the service's folklore and traditions. German-American friendship societies, established to foster cultural understanding and political alliance between the former enemies, occasionally referenced Kilroy in their educational materials as an example of successful cultural exchange. While somewhat trivializing the serious work of reconciliation and alliance building, these references acknowledge that cultural connection often begins with simple, human interactions rather than grand diplomatic gestures. A cartoon drawn by a bored soldier had contributed to transforming enemies into allies. As referenced in various studies of post-war memory and cultural history, including academic works examining how Germans remembered the occupation period, Kilroy occupied a unique space in collective memory. Unlike traumatic memories of bombing, defeat, starvation, or denazification, Kilroy was a relatively neutral memory, even occasionally nostalgic. Germans who had been young during the occupation sometimes recalled the mysterious graffiti with amusement in their older years, a benign reminder of a terrible time that nevertheless contained moments of human connection and cultural curiosity. Monica Herrmann, who had been 13 when the Americans arrived in her Bavarian village, spoke about Kilroy in a 1987 oral history interview. "We were terrified at first," she recalled. "Everything German seemed to have failed, and now foreigners controlled our lives. But then we saw these silly drawings everywhere, and we started asking the soldiers what they meant. The Americans would laugh and try to explain in broken German. Those conversations made them seem human rather than just conquerors. It was a small thing, but small things mattered when everything else was overwhelming." The German government's relationship with historical memory became increasingly complex as the Federal Republic matured. How to remember the Nazi period, the war, and the occupation involved difficult questions about guilt, responsibility, and identity. Within this fraught landscape of memory politics, symbols like Kilroy occupied a safer space. They reminded Germans of occupation without triggering the same guilt and trauma as other aspects of the period. Museum exhibitions about post-war Germany sometimes included photographs of Kilroy graffiti as visual shorthand for the American occupation years. Educational materials developed for German schoolchildren learning about post-war history occasionally mentioned Kilroy as a way to make the occupation period more concrete and accessible to young students who had no direct experience of those years. Teaching about military occupation could be abstract and dry, but a silly cartoon provided a tangible detail that students could visualize and understand. The graffiti served pedagogical purposes decades after its original appearance, helping new generations comprehend what American military presence had meant in daily life. By the 1980s and 90s, as Cold War tensions evolved and eventually the Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, reunifying Germany, the Kilroy phenomenon seemed like a quaint artifact from an earlier era. Yet historians of the immediate post-war period continued to find the phenomenon interesting as a case study in cultural exchange, soft power, and how occupied populations make sense of their occupiers. Academic articles and book chapters analyzed Kilroy within broader frameworks of occupation studies, cultural transfer, and post-war reconstruction. December 31, 1999, marked not just the end of a year but the end of a century that had seen Germany transformed from imperial power to Nazi dictatorship, to divided occupation zone to reunified democracy. As Germans reflected on their turbulent 20th century, small details like the Kilroy phenomenon acquired new significance within broader narratives of transformation and resilience. The simple graffiti that had puzzled German civilians in 1945 had become part of the historical record, documented in photographs, memoirs, and academic studies. Veterans of the American occupation forces, now in their 70s and 80s, gathered at reunions to share memories of their service in post-war Germany. Many recalled drawing Kilroy on German walls as young soldiers, a seemingly trivial act that had been part of a larger historical moment when American power reshaped Europe. These aging veterans recognized that their casual graffiti had contributed to German civilians' first impressions of American culture and values. What had seemed like mere boredom relief or playful territory marking had inadvertently served as cultural diplomacy. German historians compiling comprehensive histories of the occupation period consistently noted the Kilroy phenomenon as an example of unofficial cultural exchange. While official histories focused on political decisions, economic policies, and diplomatic negotiations, social historians recognized that ordinary Germans' daily experiences with occupation included these smaller cultural encounters. The graffiti appeared in photograph collections documenting post-war Germany, a visual marker of the American presence as recognizable as jeeps, military uniforms, or ration distribution centers. The digital age brought new life to Kilroy as images from the 1940s circulated online, introducing the phenomenon to people born decades after the occupation ended. German websites devoted to local history included sections about the occupation period with photographs of Kilroy graffiti on recognizable buildings. These images sparked discussions among younger Germans curious about what their grandparents' generation had experienced. The internet enabled new forms of engagement with historical memory, making artifacts like Kilroy accessible to global audiences interested in World War II history. Museums dedicated to Cold War history and the occupation period, including the Allied Museum in Berlin and various local history museums throughout Germany, incorporated Kilroy into their exhibits. Display panels explained the phenomenon to visitors who had no direct memory of the occupation years. Reproductions of the cartoon appeared alongside other artifacts from the period: ration cards, occupation currency, military government posters, and photographs of destroyed cities being rebuilt. Kilroy had earned his place in the material culture of post-war history. Academic conferences examining the occupation period occasionally featured papers analyzing cultural phenomena, like Kilroy within broader frameworks of military occupation, cultural exchange, and soft power. Scholars recognized that understanding how occupations work requires attention to both official policies and unofficial interactions. The graffiti represented the latter: unplanned, undirected cultural contact that nevertheless shaped how occupied populations perceived their occupiers and made decisions about cooperation, resistance, or adaptation. Survivors from that era, now quite elderly, reflected on how symbols like Kilroy connected to larger questions of identity and memory. Hans Richter, who had been a teenager during the occupation and became a history teacher in his career, spoke at his 90th birthday celebration in 2008 about unexpected lessons from that difficult period. "We thought we understood everything about power and culture because of what the Nazis had taught us," he said to the assembled family and friends. "Then the Americans arrived and covered our walls with cartoons. They defeated us militarily, but conquered us culturally through small human gestures that acknowledged our shared humanity despite everything." That cartoon of Kilroy peeking over a wall was somehow the beginning of understanding that there were other ways to organize society than what we had known. The lessons that historians, sociologists, and political scientists drew from the Kilroy phenomenon extended beyond Germany to broader discussions of military occupation and cultural interaction. How do occupying forces shape local populations' perceptions? What role does informal cultural exchange play compared to official programming? Can occupiers maintain military discipline while allowing sufficient individual expression to seem human rather than merely threatening? These questions remained relevant as subsequent generations of military planners dealt with occupations in other contexts. Comparative studies of different occupations throughout history used Kilroy as an example of successful cultural interaction that facilitated rather than hindered occupation goals. Unlike occupations characterized purely by force and fear, the American occupation of Germany benefited from countless small humanizing moments, of which Kilroy was merely the most visible and documented. These studies contributed to military doctrine and nation-building theory, suggesting that allowing soldiers some personal expression might serve strategic purposes even if it appears undisciplined. The enduring fascination with Kilroy reflected something deeper about how people make meaning from historical experience. A simple cartoon had become a symbol through which multiple meanings flowed: American cultural power, individual expression within collective endeavor, the human need to leave marks proving existence, the transformation of enemies into allies, and the unexpected ways that cultural objects acquire significance beyond their creators' intentions. Academic journals in history, sociology, cultural studies, and military affairs all found Kilroy worthy of analysis.